A house in open country, to put it boldly but honestly, is a solution. I might even say it's a universal solution. And that depends. Do you consider science to be a universal solution to a universal problem? So the scientific method, is that a universal solution to a universal problem? So what would the universal problem be? Gaining accurate understanding about the material universe. That's what the problem of inaccurate understanding of the material universe is solved by the scientific method. By at least a sound, if it's a sound application. It's solved by a sound application of the scientific method. And sound application would mean that includes sound interpretation and sound reasoning. So sound observation, sound interpretation, sound reasoning. And then vetted for its soundness. In the same way, that if you consider that the scientific method in that way to be a universal solution to a universal problem, then a house in open country is a universal solution to a universal problem in the same way. It's a method. But instead of the material world, so it's a method that welcomes the scientific method, by the way, as part of its own method. But instead of so it includes understanding the material world accurately, but it puts more of an emphasis on our reasoning about that. Our reasoning really about existence itself. It's more philosophical. Not anti-science philosophical, just philosophical. It's more existential in its scope. So where science concerns itself with worldview, a house in open country it's the opposite. Where science concerns itself with the material world, a house in open country concerns itself with worldview. Our understanding of how we live in this material world. Having an accurate understanding of how we ought to live in this material world. It's about beliefs. Beliefs are about the is and the ought. The scientific method covers the is. As long as, and our beliefs about what is will be sound if we apply sound science and sound reasoning. Sound observation, sound interpretation, sound reasoning. Worldview, I want to put, why am I talking about the beliefs? Because worldview is about beliefs. Okay, and beliefs are about is and ought. You believe things about the way the world is, and you believe things about how you ought to operate, given the is and the ought. Science and sound reasoning help give you the is. Sound reasoning also helps give you the ought. A house in open country is a method for developing a soundly reasoned ought. That method is expressed in a foundational commitment to what is true, to pursuing what is true, what is good, what is meaningful, and what is sustaining, in a spirit of honesty, humility, and conscientiousness, grounded in the context of reality, rather than in messages about reality. So you'll hear me talking about building a house in open country versus building your house in the Valley of the Domes. The Valley of the Domes is a place where beliefs are adopted from one-sided messaging, where reality is revealed by messengers giving messages about reality. And those revelations become beliefs. Those revelations, which begin as beliefs that the messengers hold, unless it's just a Machiavellian kind of messenger, but those revelations that begin as beliefs of the messenger then get presented as messages for belief, and then get believed in as revelations about reality. That's how the Valley of the Dome works. And those messages are almost always one-sided, almost always steel man versus straw man, almost always involving logical fallacies, sophistically dressed up by the sophisticated. Those messages are built for persuasion. And the persuaders often don't know that they themselves buy rhetoric. By contrast, A House in Open Country leaves the Valley of the Domes and begins its search grounded in reality, with a commitment to hearing reality's messages, getting away from all messengers and all revelations, all rhetoric, and seeking reality's messages, reality's own messages about what is true, what is good, what is meaningful, and what is sustaining. And searching for these realities in a spirit of humility, honesty, and conscientiousness. It's a method that has no place for hubris, no place for one-sided messaging, and certainly no place for unfalsifiable belief. In fact, maybe the very first principle that A House in Open Country recognizes is the uncertainty principle. Because worldview, at its foundations, any individual's worldview at their foundation, and this is realized through foundational thinking. And what foundational thinking is when you ask questions, the main question is, on what grounds? So when you're tracing back your beliefs, your worldview is your beliefs. When you're asking the question why you believe something, why do you believe that? Well, because of this. Well, why do you believe that? Why do you believe that that's true? Well, because of this. Well, why do you believe that? And you keep tracing it back to the roots of your beliefs. And it's not always just why. It can be, well, how do you know that? Or on what grounds is that, do you declare that? Or do you make that claim? Or who says? But when it comes to your belief system, you believe certain things about existence itself. Your worldview includes beliefs about, whether consciously or subconsciously, it includes beliefs about what it's all about the nature of existence itself, where it comes from, where it's going, and what it's all about. Your worldview includes that. Again, if you haven't consciously thought about it, you operate by some view of existence, some understanding of the big questions of existence. You operate with at least a subconscious understanding. And if you haven't thought about it, you should. If it is a subconscious understanding, you should take some time to think about it consciously. And A House in Open Country is pursuing a conscious understanding of existence. Now, A House in Open Country, and the reason why it does that is because it recognizes that all of our worldviews are founded on some understanding, conscious or subconscious, of the nature of existence, where it all comes from, where it's all going, what it's all about. And that doesn't mean that you have a certainty about these things, but most people do form beliefs about these things with certainty. One of the first principles that A House in Open Country recognizes is that unverifiable things are by nature uncertain. And when it comes to the big questions of existence, where it all comes from, where's it all going, what's it all about, we cannot verify any answers to these questions. We can verify that the questions exist because we're asking them, but in terms of anybody providing an answer to these questions, those answers are ultimately unverifiable. They cannot be proven true. I had to learn this the hard way. I'll get into that. That's part of my story. And it involves two very clear moments, years apart, of disillusionment. The first was a step to the second. A House in Open Country, though, recognizes, as a result of those two steps of disillusionment in my own life, because I'm the one who's developed this, because I had to, A House in Open Country recognizes that, one, the answers to these big questions about existence are unverifiable. Anybody who tells you where it all comes from, where's it all going, and what it's all about, they cannot verify what's behind that, what's behind those claims. And so House in Open Country recognizes the uncertainty principle, what we call the uncertainty principle. When it comes to The big existential questions, the answers to which rest at the foundation of our worldview, consciously or subconsciously. These questions, the answers to these questions, are unverifiable and therefore uncertain. The House and Open Country response to this is to acknowledge that. And then to further recognize that if we can't be certain about any of these big questions, or about the answers to any of these big questions that rest at the base of our worldview, then what can we do? Well, you can do the next best thing. You can have a degree of confidence. But that confidence has to be arrived at honestly. So the humility is applied first. The humility is the recognition, and that involves honesty. But the humility involving honesty recognizes first the uncertainty principle. Honesty then demands that the degree of confidence that we hold in any answer to these unverifiable questions that rests at the base of our worldview, that degree of confidence has to be arrived at honestly and conscientiously. And that means a fair hearing. That means sound reasoning that considers all things. And it considers all things fairly. That means listening to steelman arguments of all sides, of all of the different answers worth listening to. And you start to hear one, and you may discover that right away that that's really not an answer I need to finish listening to. Although you need to be careful that you're not doing that in a biased manner. Honesty demands that you give every reasonable possibility a fair shot, and that you don't declare a possibility unreasonable prematurely out of bias. The incentive for that is that reality bites. This is another thing that House and Open Country recognizes. The incentive is that we want our worldview to align with reality, because if it doesn't, reality is the ruler of this existence. And reality is the judge of our worldview. If we are operating in this existential reality in a way that is in discord with reality itself, reality has a tendency of biting. Biting those whose beliefs, whose worldview, whose beliefs about reality are inconsistent with reality itself. I'll give an illustration of that with regard to the ranger at the canyon. I'm not going to get into that right now, because I want to continue this thought about House and Open Country's position on these things. So a House and Open Country puts an emphasis on honesty and humility, intellectual honesty and intellectual humility and intellectual conscientiousness with regard to answering these big questions that rest at the base of our worldview, or with regard to the degree of confidence that we place in them, and with regard to the fair hearing that we carry out in attempting to answer these questions. The fair hearing is incentivized by the reality that reality bites. And whether that bite takes place immediately or is reserved for a later time, whether in this life or, if there is a next life, in the next life, if there is an afterlife, in the afterlife. I, by the way, am very agnostic. I have my leanings, but I'm agnostic. I'll get into my leanings later. I'll get into why I'm an agnostic. I mean, you're hearing basically why I'm an agnostic. So I don't know how much I need. That will keep becoming more and more clear. We'll also be talking in future about my leanings. But a House and Open Country is incentivized to create a worldview that's consistent with reality, because reality bites. So because, number one, reality rules all. Two, reality in its ruling judges all. And three, in reality's judgment, we can be bitten or blessed by reality. We can be rewarded or punished by reality. So a house in open country is incentivized by risk mitigation. Recognizing that unrealistic belief risks reality's bite. That's just self-preservation. A house in open country is incentivized by self-preservation. Recognizing that unrealistic belief risks reality's bite, so self-preservation demands realistic belief. Realistic belief demands sound reasoning. Or you might say a fair hearing with regard to any given belief. And that's what honesty and humility, intellectual honesty, intellectual humility, intellectual conscientiousness lead to. A fair hearing. So in our search for, so in the context of reality, not the Valley of the Domes, away from all messengers with their revelations about reality, and just listening to reality's messages itself, a house in open country, grounded in that, is looking to establish what is true, what is good, what is meaningful, and what is sustaining in our existence. Or about our existence. About and in our existence. What is true, what is good, what is meaningful, and what is sustaining. In a spirit of honesty and humility and conscientiousness. Intellectual honesty, intellectual humility, intellectual conscientiousness. Through the medium of the fair hearing. All incentivized by the fact that reality rules all. In its ruling, reality judges all. And in its judgment, reality bites or reality blesses. By the way, when you're not being bitten, you're at least temporarily within the bounds of reality's blessing. Though that does not mean that what you're doing will not eventually result in reality's bite. So I should say, it may be that you're under the impression, it's possible for you to be under the impression of having reality's blessing because you're not being bitten, when in fact the bite is just delayed because of, that's the nature of reality's response. That's the reality of how this kind of thing goes. Oftentimes the bite is delayed. But that does not affirm, certainly doesn't confirm, it doesn't even affirm reality's blessing. To put it simply, we just want the truth. Because deceiving ourselves can result in harm to ourselves and others. And so a house in open country, not wanting to do harm to ourselves, not wanting to do harm to others, is committed to discovering the truth. And to do it, but to necessitate that those three keystones are in place in the search for the truth. The truth about what is true, the truth about what is good, the truth about what is meaningful, and the truth about what is sustaining in reality. The three keystones that have to be in those four foundational walls. House in open country is about building a house on those four foundational walls with these three keystones: intellectual honesty, intellectual humility, and intellectual conscientiousness. A house in open country demands that. In its search for, in a nutshell, what is wise. So if you take all of this together, it's searching for wisdom. Wisdom, let me put it this way, the difference between a wise decision and a foolish one, or a wise way of going about things and a foolish way of going about things. The difference between wisdom and foolishness is the difference between what's actually going to achieve your objective and what isn't in reality. A wise person understands accurately the way things are, how it all works, and what doesn't work. That is wisdom. It's understanding, an accurate understanding of the way things are, how it all works and what doesn't work. A house in open country, in its wisdom, is devoted to that accurate understanding. And by contrast, it recognizes the pervasiveness of foolishness in the world and the danger that that foolishness poses to all of us. It is foolish to believe carelessly. Again, the ranger at the canyon. And yet, the vast majority of people are carelessly convinced of their beliefs and cling to them unfalsifiably. And then further, crusade on their behalf. And then when reality bites, or when reality gives every indication of biting in the future, those same believers, those same crusaders who are convinced unfalsifiably so in their beliefs and in their crusade, and who love those beliefs and their crusade, in their love for those beliefs and their crusade, are motivated to explain away every instance and every indication of reality's bite. So that in spite of the fact that reality is biting, in spite of the fact that reality is heralding a forthcoming bite, even fatal bites, and heralding forthcoming fatal bites, in spite of that, the believers and crusaders who are being bitten, or causing others to be bitten, or who are threatened with being bitten, or of others being bitten, by reality, these believers and these crusaders continue in these unrealistic and unreasonable beliefs and crusades, in these destructive beliefs and crusades, finding every excuse to explain away the destruction, to explain away, to dismiss the connection between cause and effect. They see the destructive effects and refusing to connect it with their cause, they blame it on something else. Why? Because they love their belief. And they love it despite the fact, despite all of the evidence against its truth, against its veracity and its goodness. All of the evidence against its consistency with reality, or all of the evidence of its inconsistency with reality. They love it despite all of that, because they can explain all that away. And they love it, and they continue to find every way to stay in love with it, despite the fact that they carelessly, unreasonably entered into that belief in the first place. This is what A House in Open Country is meant to save us from. Just like the scientific method was meant to save us from unrealistic belief about what is, with regard to the material universe. A House in Open Country is meant to save us from unrealistic belief, both about what is and about how we ought to operate in this is. I do this for myself and for my kids directly, and then for my kids indirectly by offering it to the rest of the world in which they have to live. My kids, because of intellectual honesty, intellectual humility, intellectual conscientiousness in the pursuit of what is true, what is good, what is meaningful, and what is sustaining in reality, my kids make the world a better place. Plato said something like, live in such a way that if everyone were to live in the same way, so live in such a way in society, that if everyone were to live in the same way in that society, that would be a society you would want to live in. Live in such a way that if everyone were to live in the same way, that would be a society you would want to live in. If society were filled with people like my kids, what a world. What a society. If the world were filled with people like my kids, that's a world I want to live in. My kids are my resume. And A House in Open Country is my method for raising wonderful kids. And the reason why they're so wonderful is because of the principles that rest at the foundation of the method of a house in open country. The same principles that feed a house in open country are the same principles that fed our parenting. And it is a running theme in the life of our family, for friends and strangers alike, to stop my wife and I and ask us, how did you raise such great kids? The word they usually use is amazing. And they are. Our kids, especially in contrast to their generation. It's highly unfortunate that this is the case, but it is the case. Especially in contrast to their generation, my kids are amazing. Our kids are amazing. The principles that rest, or the principles that found a house in open country, I mean that in two different ways, actually. The principles that found a house in open country and the results of the application of that method are the same principles and the same results that informed our parenting, or that formed the spirit in which we parented. Now, there's a lot more to say about raising wonderful kids. It's not just the principles of a house in open country. Most significantly, it is what a house in open country agrees with. If you are intellectually honest and intellectually humble and intellectually conscientious in your pursuit of what is true and what is good and what is meaningful and what is sustaining in reality, you will discover that affection for your kids goes a long way. That affection for your kids is good and meaningful and sustaining. My wife and I had that affection for our children long before a house in open country came along. So most significantly, that was always there, and that played a big part in raising amazing kids. But I'm not going to go into any more about the ins and outs of raising amazing kids. I only wanted to mention it because my kids are my resume. If the world was filled with people like my kids, what a world. Far more sanity, far more wisdom, far more actual virtue, and values that align with reality's blessing and not cursing, and not bite, and far less conflict, far less crusading, far less polarization, because there would be far more humility, far more honesty, far more conscientiousness in the pursuit of what is truly true, what is truly good, what is truly meaningful, and what is truly sustaining. That's what a house in open country offers. The end.